Hello, good evening, everyone. I welcome you once again to another session of the online reading club titled The Malgudi Group. Today, we are going to talk about the poetry of Jayanta Mahapatra, who was the first Indian poet to receive the Sahitya Akademi Award for English poetry. As many of us know, he passed away recently on 27th August in his hometown, Cuttack. His poetry is difficult, as many readers have confessed while reading him. And I would like to begin with his response to this comment by readers and reviewers. Of what use is a poem if it is an easily understood collection of words more in the manner of a statement? For me, the beauty of a poem lies in its element of the unknown, its quality of mystery. A poem is knit together by an inconceivable silence of which words are but manifestations. Inconceivable silence. That is what we would like to begin with while talking about his poetry. And I would like to invite Dr. Bidyut Bhushan Jena, who is an assistant professor at Christ Deemed to Be University, Bangalore, to share his experience of touching that inconceivable silence while reading Jayanta Mahapatra. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity, and really good to see everyone here. And thank you for initiating this discussion and creating the group. And it's interesting that it's called Malgudi, because a place which is nowhere can be anywhere. I mean, somebody who is nobody can be anybody in that sense. And first of all, this is also not only to celebrate Jayanta Mahapatra, also to celebrate my friendship with Shatarupa, which goes back many years, and also all of you. And we are meeting for the first time, but as time passes by, we'll know each other a bit more. And it's interesting that silence is the substratum for poetry. And so my reflection on this inconceivable silence would be twofold. First, as a poet, and the way I, to some extent, I'm deliberately using the word no Jayanta Mahapatra because poets live on, and I was lucky enough to meet him twice as a MA student in Utkal University, then as a PhD scholar at EFL University, which was called CIFL, and so it's a very unassuming person, and his life goes on to prove that you don't have to be part of English department to do poetry. In fact, the way I look at English department now, I think people in the English department would solely be responsible to ruin poetry for life. And that is what I feel, because everything becomes a discourse, and everybody is so hell-bent on inflicting a discourse on the most emotive aspect of life also, which is how that has become research these days, because everywhere we see the other, but poetry is not about the other. In poetry, the other is just an extension of the self, and that way the poetic is very important, and that it's all about that culminating silence in poetry. And a few months ago, I have had, I used to come exchange messages with Jayanta Mahapatra on WhatsApp. And I was quite amazed to see that at the age of 95, he was quite prompt in replying to messages. And I shouldn't have done it, but I have done it because I was tempted. I had to record some of our conversations also, because I thought that is what I thought of doing then, and I did that. And I remember sharing my books with him, and he would be generous enough to really appreciate my work. But he told me in one of my conversations with him that Vidyut, uh, uh, never try to be a popular poet. Try to be a genuine poet. And it's very easy to be popular, and it's easy to be all over the place. But do serious poetry. That is the exact expression that he used. And if we read Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry, we realize that it stems from a sense of some kind of a culminating dense silence, I think. I remember reading Raja Rao, the poet, so many years ago. He has a book called The Meaning of India. In Raja Rao, while talking about this Indian tradition of poetry, he says that language is sound is nothing but compounded silence, actually. And it has its origin in the silence, and when everything is said and done, we go back to that silence, actually. And personally, I have been quite drawn to Jayanta Mahapatra's silence in his poetry. 1 minute, just a minute, my mother is calling. So I remember reading so many of his poems, and also I have read his translation, because Jayanta Mahapatra was also a very unique translator. And Jayanta Mahapatra also has translated some of the great Odia poets, including Guru Prasad Mahanti. And I think the Pallavi wouldn't know Guru Prasad Mahanti, but Guru Prasad Mahanti is one of the finest modern Indian poets who wrote in Odia. He's one of the, I would say, one of the finest poets who was part of that period in our country's history. So Guru Prasad Mahanti's poems also have been translated by Jayanta Mahapatra. So Jayanta Mahapatra had a quite late entry into poetry, very much like the Marathi poet Arun Kolatkar, for example. And these days, people want to be famous, overnight, right? So people in the 1920s, they suddenly want to be Instagram sensations. But Jayanta Mahapatra made his foray into poetry at a very later life, when he was in his 40s. So he taught physics, actually, in Sambalpur, and maybe that led to some kind of chemistry towards poetry. And initially, so many of his writings were rejected, and I remember him telling me, Vidyut, send your poems to different places and get rejected first. So and I remember him telling me that, Vidyut, in our time it was quite difficult to send poetry because we had to do it via post. Now you can do it via email, and it's easy. So anyway, coming back to this idea of silence in his poetry, if you read one of his poems called Hunger, for example, which is often quoted, and you see the silence of the father, and how, in a way, silence is that realm which sometimes is defiled by the use of language, and in fact the use of words, for example. And poetry as a mode of human expression, which I think is the closest to silence. That way, personally, even though I teach philosophy here, but I would consider poetry um, subtler compared to philosophy. But they don't do different things, by the way. They do things differently. They are concerned with truth. So So it is believed that a particular idea begins as an impulsion. If you talk about that Dhvani theory, Spoto and Dhvani, a particular idea begins as an impulsion, then it becomes a prehension. What is a prehension? Prehension is a perception without cognition. When we utter a word, it actually doesn't have a meaning. Then meaning is attributed to it. For example, if we buzz into a room and we see a table, but actually we did not see a table first. We saw an object, and in a split second, and that object turns into a table, because suddenly naming happens, and it happens in such a split second that we don't realize that it happened. So some kind of a indefinite perception leading to a definite perception in that context. We did not see a table, we saw an object. Okay. So similarly, a particular idea begins as an impulsion, then it becomes a prehension, perception without cognition, then it is concretized, then it becomes mundane, then it is used by everyone, and it is the responsibility of a kavi. Now, the word kavi in Indian context is very interesting. Kavi is not merely a poet. Kavi is a sage. Now, who is a sage? A sage is somebody who knows the undulating whisper of time. A sage is somebody who understands the mystery of existence. So that's why Tagore was called a kavi. He was not just a poet. Kavi has a very different meaning, actually, in the Indian context. Sometimes there are certain words that are non-translatables. We cannot translate the meaning. The way philosophy is not darshan, uh, or darshan is not philosophy. So anyway, so it begins as an impulsion, then it becomes a prehension, then it becomes concretized, then it becomes mundane, then everybody uses it without meaning, also without understanding it. It is the responsibility of a kavi to trace the word backward to its original source of silence so that it becomes light. That's why Bhartahari in his Vakyapadiyam writes that Padam Sharvam Bhashate. Words illumine everything. The word is connected to light. So, what is light, by the way? Light makes everything visible. Light illuminates everything. That's why, if you look at the word Veda, Veda has come from the word. See, there are some Veda is from the it has got to do with seeing. That's why Indian philosophy is called darshan. Why is darshan? Darshan is not only seeing. Darshan also means insight. Suppose I'm having a conversation with you and I understand something. I say, "Oh, I see." I see means I have an insight into things. Okay. So there is a Latin word called videre. Videre means to appear. Vision, video, everything has got to do with seeing. So darshan. So poetry illuminates something which otherwise eludes and escapes our quotidian mundane existence. That doesn't mean poetry deviates from the quotidian. Poetry uses the quotidian, and as William Wordsworth would say, it shows common things in an uncommon light. So that way. So that is exactly what Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry did. In fact, any readers of poetry, lyrical poetry, would suddenly not understand Jayanta Mahapatra because he used a very crude, very prosaic kind of language in his poetry. But poetry is not about the words that we use, but poetry is about the internal melody that you have. Okay, what you intend to drive home. In fact, when Walt Whitman was writing poetry, there are many critics. Even in America, also, he didn't get the due that he deserved. And many people called his poetry as a mechanical assortment of filth because he was, using, as some critics of free verse poetry would say, chopped prose. Okay. And in Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry, I see that in Odia we have a word called rukhya. Rukhya gadya. Gadya means a prose. Rukhya means very, very not refined prose. However, it is too powerful because human life is not polished. Actually, literature tries to impose some kind of a form on an otherwise rubble, but life is not that polished. Life is all about this, half tones, this tripping and falling and getting bruises and suffering, and maybe suffering is a preparation for that. Okay, so in Jayanta Mahapatra, I see that. I see in Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry and also his life. He had a very difficult life, very, very difficult life. And he would never acknowledge it, but he was very lonely towards the end of his life. Uh, Wife died so many years ago. Son died in an accident. And whenever I would have a conversation with him, whenever I would talk to him, he would tell me with his very sweet, unassuming voice. I think people who have interacted with me would know. And he would say in Odia, "Ghorku asa," come home sometimes. So he lived in a place called Tinikunia Bagicha in Cuttack district. And he would always tell me. And my last conversation with him was, he was asking me, "Kebe etik asiar nahi? Are you not planning to come to Odisha?" And such a lazy person that I am, I missed that opportunity. I wanted to meet him actually. I wanted to go back to Odisha and I wanted to meet him. That didn't happen. And I somehow realized when some of my messages went unanswered some months ago, I realized that something was wrong. And I didn't know that he was writing the final poem, his life, in a way, the way Camus would say in his Myth of Sisyphus, that you start writing a poem, and like suicide is a poem, and when you commit suicide, the poem comes to an end. So it is not suicide for him, but anyway, it was maybe a peaceful snuffing out of a very, very long life. And he belonged to the trio, A.K. Ramanujan, R. Parthasarathi, and Jayanta Mahapatra. Only R. Parthasarathi is alive. So when we keep talking, I'll bring in more. Suddenly, I am having severe stomach upset and feverish. I'm feeling, but I will talk when we go along. So that silence, we'll talk. Let other people also.
Thank you, sir. That was lovely. And you are a poet, and that's why you could talk about that element of silence in such a beautiful way. I think you took us from that silence which escapes, the silence which somehow is not expressed towards light, and then you brought us from light again towards silence when you were talking about those last days of the poet. When you were talking about the trio, a thought came to my mind. He was different from A.K. Ramanujan and R. Parthasarathi. I think both of them settled abroad, and in many of their poems, we see the element of exile, the element of being, away from home, that nostalgia. But if we look at Jayanta Mahapatra's work, his poetry is very much connected to his hometown.
Yeah.
And that's because he spent most of his life there, and he chose to remain in India and in Odisha, in his home, because he felt that if you want to write poetry, it should be about your place. And if we talk about that beautiful poem, Somewhere My Man, he says, a man does not mean anything but the place. Sitting on the river bank, throwing pebbles into the muddy current, a man becomes the place. Even that simple enough thing. So his connection with his place, Cuttack, what was it like? What do you think Cuttack meant to him? And his place, many of his poems are based on the Puri sea beach. So what do you think this rootedness in one's place, and what does it mean for a poet to actually not leave his place to be in his place and to write about his place in English, in a language which actually does not belong to his place. But in some of the interviews that I have read, he was often asked the same question, which I think was put to Kamala Das, to why do you write in English? Why have you chosen this language? Why don't you write in Odia? And it is interesting that he says, I find joy in this language. And it is a language that is hard earned because I come from such a background, such an economic background, where I have seen poverty. And as we all know, his grandfather, he converted to Christianity just because of the 1866 rice famine in Odisha, because of the hunger. And his father was also a sub-inspector of primary schools. So it was not a lot of money, that supported his family. And even with that meager earning, his father ensured that Jayanta Mahapatra went to an English medium school. And he says, I remember I was the youngest and poorest boy in my class. And he says, this language is hard earned. And during childhood, I would go to a very solitary place. He was solitary, from that time. You mentioned loneliness. He says that he was solitary, from his childhood days. And he had a particular spot where he would go and read English novels, English and American novels. So that was how the language became his own. And he said that I would use this language to talk about myself, my family, my place, my culture, because ultimately, why should I talk about other things when, we cannot spend one life. It is not long enough for us to talk about our things. So, he answered this question in that way, that there's nothing else to talk about except me, my place, and my culture. So what do you say to that?
Actually, you are right. Even in one of the interviews, I think it's your Odisha Literature Festival, my teacher, Professor Jatindra Kumar Naik, asked him the same question. Because Jayanta Mahapatra, I don't know if many people know about it, because he was somebody who has read poetry with Derek Walcott also on the same platform. And he was such a famous person, but he wanted to be in this small town, Odisha, of Cuttack, which is more than 1,000 year old. There was another person in Odisha who loved Cuttack a lot, Akshay Mahanti, the Odia poet and also singer, artist. I think language is sometimes pure accident. And I would like to create a separate language from words. Language can exist on its own without the scaffolding of words. For example, when you are running fever, if your mother places her hand on your forehead, you feel something. It's not words, actually. It's language. So when I say Odia is my, somebody asked me, what is Odia for you? For me, Odia is my mother tongue because it's a landscape. It's an intimate landscape. Okay. And so in any language where you find the broken fragment of your being is your language at that level. Okay. And sometimes when language meets words, then it is called anahatanada, which is the unstruck sound. When language doesn't meet words, it's called ahata, injured. For example, when we say something without meaning it, really, we are actually injuring language. We don't mean it. Like in Kalidasa would write in his Raghuvamsham, Vagartha Vyava Samprutav Vagartha Pratipataye, Jagato Pitaro Bande, Parvati Parameshwara. Language and words, language and meaning are connected like that, like the primal Purusha and primal Prakriti. So the English that we use, it is actually soaked in our sensibility. It is not the English of the Queen. And also, I have taught students from the UK. I've been teaching them for quite some years now, and there's no one English also in that way that we use. And also, why not speak English in our own accent also? And why not use, for example, Indians now use something called prepone. There is no word in English called prepone, but we use it. And some Indians would say that, I passed out BA. It's not passed out, it is graduate. But we use it, okay, because it has become a part of this common tongue, as it were. So Jayanta Mahapatra's English was actually, of course, as you just rightly pointed out, how it is the language that was acquired. And about you spoke about his grandfather. Here, there's a poem also on grandfather, and how the missionaries, they just gave them a choice: either if you want benefits, you have to convert. So there are no other choice actually in that sense. But the question arises is that even though it was the English language, but the sensibility was quite Odia in that sense. That's thus quite Indian. Now, when I say Odia, am I trying to confine Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry to Odisha? I am not. Because the more local you are, the more universal you are. That is not something that I created. I filched this statement from the maker of the film Kantara. The most local you are, the most universal you are. Okay, just imagine, we are not reading Dostoevsky just because Dostoevsky is Indian. Okay, here I would like to give an example of the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. Now, Borges talks about, he has an essay called Argentinian Writer, the Argentinian Writer. He talks about the Argentinian sensibility. Now, to be an Indian, you need not talk about India only in your writing. The way, even though an Argentinian writer doesn't talk about Argentina, yet he or she can be an Argentinian writer, because when an Argentinian writer talks about nightingale, then now the word bird nightingale is more mythical than real. And when an Argentinian writer uses the word nightingale, we understand that it's an Argentinian writer, because Argentinian sensibility is, even though their house is on fire, they'll talk about some other thing. So what makes us Indian? What makes us a poet, a global poet? It's not the locality of the language. It's not the specificity of the place, but the universality of sensibility. Okay, and I think Jayanta Mahapatra had that. As another great poet, Ramakant Rath, writes in one of his prefaces that the poets are a strange species. They dream of a sky, and their entire life they strive to find a ground for it. And I think in Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry, we saw that universal sensibility. That when we read hunger, we understand the pang of a father. And why is it now? I think it was Samuel Beckett who said in his play Waiting for Godot that the tears of the world are a constant quantity. That now also mothers sell their kids. Okay, when you write a poem about Ahalya, now Ahalya is not just the Ahalya of Ramayana. Now also there are Ahalyas who work in IT sector. Now also there are Ahalyas who are single mothers. Now also there are Ahalyas who fight in this male-dominated world. Now also there are Ahalyas who write poetry, and that poetry is not using words, but also trying to soften the edges of chapati on a plate, on a tawa maybe, on a what do you call that, kadai or whatever. Okay, so the question is, Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry was soaked in that human sensibility. It was not like one of the characters in George Eliot's novel. If you put a drop of blood under a microscope, you see only colons, semicolons, and commas. No, Jayanta Mahapatra's writing, thrive, throbbed with humanity, and that is in fact one of the reasons that make his poetry universal. Thus, language is not so much important, actually. Okay, and it's not about bhasa, but it's all about bhava, which is more important than bhasa. And I think Jayanta Mahapatra had no dearth of bhava in his poetry. That's why it connected. I'll give you as an aside, when the Jewish American writer Saul Bellow got Nobel Prize, and there were some critics who questioned his language and grammar and all that, and he went on to say that, do you read my novels for that, really? Okay, and we can understand that when we listen to somebody really great, and we after a point lose track of the grammar, the syntax, the language, what we go for is the essence, actually. And Jayanta Mahapatra's language was impeccable, grammar was impeccable. When I was doing MA in Utkal University, I had translated his book Door of Paper. He wrote that in English. I translated that book to Odia, into Odia. Some 50 pages I had translated. I told him also, it never got published. And what I translated, look at this. And he wrote both in English and Odia. I think he was one of the last luminaries of that bilingual, he's one of the last bilingual poets, I would say. Well, not last, some of us are still there. But all I'm trying to say is that Jayanta Mahapatra excelled both in English and Odia. And I think later in his life, he wrote more Odia poetry than English. And also he wrote his memoir called Bor Motiro Kanapulo, which I have ordered. That book, I haven't read it. And I remember he sent me a message that Podiki Moba Ragyuni. After reading, don't be upset with me. I have written so many things in that memoir. Okay, so I think he wrote, for him it was not the language alone, but he loved Odisha. In fact, he once wrote to the Odisha government when he had gone somewhere to eat, and he saw on the plate Lord Jagannath's face or photo. He didn't like it. He said, "You cannot disrespect our God like this." He wrote to, actually, the Odisha government. I think somebody he wrote to. So he was quite connected to not only Odisha, but also connected to the world. And that is the reason why you see Pallavi is from Jammu. We are from all different parts. We are sitting together to celebrate this poet. Yeah.
Yes, really, you have talked about the different themes that come under the term bhava, and very rightly you have said that bhava was more important to him than bhasha. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, he was comfortable in both the languages, though initially he was not comfortable with Odia because he confessed that he didn't have a very good vocabulary in Odia, but he was very confident in using English. But in the later years, he did write a lot in Odia. And I have started reading this book, this autobiography, which he has written in Odia, Bhor Motiro Kanafula. And, I was just thinking about how to translate this into English so that the sense would, be achieved. Though there is a photograph of dewdrops here, and he means to say that, those dewdrops are like pearl stud earrings, and they come very early in the morning. They appear very early in the morning. But, just saying Bhor Motiro Kanafula and then talking about it in English, there is a lot in between. And we want that in betweenness. We are not satisfied with, what we can say it in English, but we want to access that space in between the Odia language and what it would be.
Actually, poetry does that, right? So in the sense, it's this tension between the desire to say and the perennial unsayability of the world. That's what I think in the film. Sorry, I hope I didn't interrupt you. I
No,
was
no, please go ahead.
in that connection that and that film Aligarh. There is a film where these two people are having Manoj Bajpayee's character and Rajkumar Rao, that that the poetry exists in the spaces between words and in the silence. Now you are right. It's extremely difficult to translate those unsaid, and I think translators who attempt to do that and succeed to some extent are considered to be really insightful translators. In that sense, yeah.
Yes, and in that connection, I would just like to, tell our viewers what Jayanta Mahapatra thought about that element of mystery. Mystery is like the rain, falling like false jewels in the sky, which catch the light as they fall, like the trail of a rainbow. And perhaps it is these bits of a rainbow which a poem should catch to be able to move the reader. And I feel it's a very beautiful way of expressing what mystery is like and how mystery is embodied in the language of a poem and how it is, we can say, decoded by readers. And as you rightly said, there are a lot of such universal themes which we find in Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry. And though he remained in Odisha, the themes he writes about, they are something which readers from all over the world they can identify with. And that is why his poetry appeared in a lot of magazines published abroad, in Times Literary Supplement and Critical Quarterly and Hudson Review, and so many other magazines they published his poetry. And these themes of rain, winds, rivers, then fields of desolate rice, raucous crows, mango trees, the wide temple street, statues of gods and goddesses being borne in procession by sturdy men, nameless leprous beings crouching near the temple premises, married couples taking a siesta, naked children, haughty-looking saffron-robed priests, a rickshaw puller idly waiting for fares. All these images that we see in his poetry, of course, anyone could identify with them. The image of a rickshaw puller, maybe, in a country where we do not have rickshaws like that, but the feelings, the emotive quality in that interaction would, of course, be accessible by anyone in any part of the world. So, as you rightly said, a poem first comes as an image, something, that's there, something which comes to mind. And when Jayanta Mahapatra was asked about his, his process of writing poetry, I think he had something very nice to say, which I would like to share with our viewers. A question I would like to ask you is about your own poems. How does a poem first occur to you? That was the question asked in one of the interviews. And then he says, it comes to me with a phrase or an image as something I feel almost physically. Then it becomes hard to get rid of. Sometimes I'm terribly restless with the poem and I pace up and down the house at night, holding on to the knot of feeling, not knowing how it would unravel. But somehow, sometime, you think you have written a poem that works, and it leaves you then with distinct feelings. You feel humility, you feel gratitude, and then you are suddenly burdened by the fear of your not being able to repeat what you have just done. Write another good poem. So you are a poet, Vidyut. What do you have to say to this?
You also are a poet. I think both of us. See, there are different processes of writing. There is this poet called Gertrude Stein, and she had her attention span was only of 15 minutes. She would write for 15 minutes, roam around, and come back and write. Also, what has happened to me is that when because I began writing poetry very early in my life. I think my first poem came on radio when I was just 14, but before that I was writing poetry. And sometimes you write one line. I mean, I don't tell this to many people because they would think that I'm nuts. But sometimes what happens is that some poems have come to me uh, in their entirety in my dreams. And sometimes I write one line, and the language would be benign enough to offer me lines from different nondescript corners of this world. Okay, and it's something magical actually happens in the context of writing. I think people who write only would know this. I think this is exactly what Susan Sontag in her essay Against Interpretation was talking about. How how this Marxist and psychoanalytic interpretations have damaged literature so much, and how she wanted to reinstate the fact that uh, there is a sense of mystery attached to it, which at least in the first part of his essay, Walter Benjamin talks about the work of art in a world of mechanical reproduction. That talks about that aura and authenticity. Uh, Sometimes it's an unfair question actually to ask a poet as to how you write, because a poet wouldn't know. Okay, and people who want to know how somebody writes, they're mostly not poets but university professors. So where poetry is discussed. Okay, and I remember now that you spoke about Jayanta Mahapatra being asked this question. Somebody at IFLU asked this question to Jayanta Mahapatra. So we were listening to Jayanta Mahapatra with rapt attention, and this girl stood up and asked, "Why don't you write poems on feminism? Why don't you write poems on gender studies?" Now, Jayanta Mahapatra is such an unassuming person. He said this, "Dear, I am I'm a conservative poet. I still remember what Jayanta Mahapatra said, that I'm a conservative poet. My poetry is like a cosmos. It has something for everyone. I don't sit down one morning to say, okay, today I'll write a feminist poem, or today I'll write a poem on gender. Okay. But the world is full of such poets. I remember some 2-3 gentlemen had contacted me from the UK, that we like your poetry. Would you like to contribute to a collection on gender? I said, I've never written poems like that. In the sense, I've written poems about the world, about men, women, about animals, about trees, plants, but I would never categorize them or sit down together. Today, I'll curate a poem, customize it for gender. So it doesn't work like that, actually. And I think the exactly same thing happened with Jayanta Mahapatra. I don't think if you read his poetry, because I have this collection of Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry. Paperwala has published this. This is a beautiful. I just recently ordered this book, and Jayanta Mahapatra. If you read all his poems, as you rightly pointed out, it's poetry is on varied themes. I mean, it's not only about loneliness. Look at some of the titles. falling into intimacy, what might happen, a self-portrait, the evening, elsewhere, the left side of life. Okay, here you go. Then 2013, you have Deaths in Odisha. Okay, and he has a poem, you'll be surprised to know, he has exploited history so well. He has a poem called Dhauli, that's Antistupa, and how he, captures the whatever happened, and how, the edicts of Ashoka do not quite catch the sorrow that people must have undergone after the war, and all that. So, how poetry happens to him? Yes, he beautifully talks about it, as you said, that how it appears, But I have seen some of his interviews. He doesn't dodge the question, but he answers it in a certain way. For example, you spoke about the rickshaw puller. When he was asked a question about his not leaving Odisha and being in Cuttack all his life, he says that he would stand at his gate and wave at the panwala, the brittle shop owner, and that conversation that would transpire between them, and that would spur that just the sheer happiness of it. I think this is exactly what R.K. Narayan writes in his book Banyan Tree and Other Stories, in the introduction to the book, that you would just go to the nearby market, not with the intention of picking up stories, but for the sheer joy of seeing people. Okay, and that gives rise to poetry. And then we give some trimming here and there, we do that. I think Ruskin Bond once said something beautifully in his uh, an autobiographical collection. I'm forgetting the name of the book here, where he says that some of us are born sensitive, and on top of that, if we are pulled about in different directions, we might end up becoming writers. And we do not become writers in schools of creative writing. We become writers before we know what it is to write, and the rest is putting things in order. And that shaping, that crafting comes much later. But I think a poet is someone, if a poet stands by the window and pushes the curtain to one side and looks at the sky, she is writing. Actually, it's not about the embodiment, the palpable, the permutation and combination of words. Exactly. That's why something that happens to us, which is quite sensual, which the British philosopher Iris Murdoch would call it literature as a sexual art. Now, because some kind of arousal happens, not always sexual arousal, but we are aroused at the level of senses. It's quite mysterious. I think as a poet, you would also know, and how we write really. There are some poems we don't like, but the world likes. Okay, but there are some poems that we feel as though we have really encapsulated our being, that completely falls on deaf ears. So very interesting, by the way. And but yes, some people have looked upon Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry as sometimes very descriptive, but that is not the only style he had. Look at the poem called Dhauli, very short and pithy in that sense also. I think both of us are talking. Maybe Anuradha, Pallavi, and Nikita would.
Yes, now I was planning to do that because we have been talking for almost an hour now, and we usually wind up our sessions around an hour. So we would continue the discussion on Jayanta Mahapatra, because one session isn't enough to talk about his poetry. So we would continue discussions on the poet and his poetry, his world of words. And you have also, in a very touching way, talked about the process of writing poetry, and I think many of us would identify with that angst, that anxiety of you know uh, of being in that process of dealing with convictions, sometimes questioning those convictions. And I know in our audience, there are also poets. I know Nikita writes poetry, and I know Pallavi is passionate about, poetry, Urdu poetry. And, perhaps we could listen to them. Perhaps they could tell us what this discussion on Jayanta Mahapatra's poems meant to them, and how this conversation, um, created the world of Jayanta Mahapatra before their eyes. So we would like to listen to any of our audience who would like to speak and contribute. Yes. Anything that comes to mind. Yes, Pallavi.
Ma'am, I was thinking actually that I haven't read Jayanta Mahapatra much. I have read few of his poems, and but I'm very much intrigued to read him more after listening you both. I think I should start with what I know of. I was listening a lecture a few days back related to my research, and it was a lecture by Abhishek Parui from IIT Madras, and he was talking about the connection between memory studies and literature, and he said a very beautiful thing, that where literature where we could place literature in relation to memory studies, why memory studies is an important lens when it comes to literature, because it has been studied in psychology, anthropology, AI, and many other areas. And he said very beautiful thing, that neuroscience is studying brain, and they are reaching to new insights about brain, that how it works and all those things, electrochemical reactions and everything. But one thing which neuroscience yet don't know about is how brain becomes the mind. For example, if we say why someone is feeling shy, or why someone behave a certain way when he or she is in love, we can't tell. And that is where literature comes into perspective, and that is where why literature is important, because literature can tell it in different ways. So when you were talking about poems, and I was reading Rilke yesterday, and I have read Letters to a Young Poet so many times that I time and again sit with it, and now as I'm talking about it, I'm having goosebumps again. And as Vidyut sir was talking about that sensation, there is that sensation which you can't, which is undescribable. I was thinking, I thought a lot about it. Not thought, but I was sitting with words and just reading it again and again, just to feel that feeling. So I think I was reading one of Jayanta Mahapatra's interviews where he was talking about this writing, and he said, I'm quoting him, and he said that writing do help somehow to relieve the pressures one suffers from. And in my case, it is true about reading. Yet, because I don't write that much, but when I read, I feel these kind of things. I would say uncanny, and which we don't have words for, but we feel things. And he says that there is no denying this to a certain extent. I would say speaking out one's innermost thoughts eases one. And yet, once you have finished with a poem and it is there in front of you, printed and placed well in a book or a journal, you somehow come to realize that the poem is an illusion. It is no more the reality that prompted you to write the poem. So, what do? You are back again where you started. The poem is but a symbol of your own life. You know it is not real. A few more years, and there is only the ash of your poem left behind. But I suppose one is always grateful to have had the experience to write a poem. It gives you unmistakably another level of experience. I mean, it also purges you to live your life a little differently. This is not very apparent at first, but the push towards a different direction that your life might take is there. And I would say, in my case, it happens me when I read something which goes deep inside. I don't know where it goes, but it touches something that I feel different, and it makes me more human. It makes me feel more of everything. It makes my sensibilities go higher, and I feel everything a little bit more. So yeah, I would read him. And thank you so much for such an intriguing start. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Pallavi. That was really sweet. I know how passionate you are when you talk about reading or even listening to ghazals. I know how deeply, you are attentive to the words and what they could connote or signify. So yes, Pallavi is from Jammu, and we are happy that she feels drawn to the poetry of Jayanta Mahapatra, and she says that she would read him. And we can tell you that it would be a very vast world that you would be entering, and you would relate to these little images. For instance, there is a poem. It says 5 Indian songs, and there are these little images. These very short images of a battered street in Cuttack. So an image of violence alongside dirty ponds and sick children. And then you have images of silent schools, and saying that even schools are based on silence. There's not commotion in schools all the time. So what is childhood then? Then there is this question about childhood. And as Bidyut sir said, even his childhood was not a very common childhood, a happy childhood, but it was full of pain. And that is why this question about childhood keeps haunting him. And he says that childhood never leaves us, he says. But then suddenly he talks about the silent suffering of lepers. So all these images in one poem titled 5 Indian Songs. So, when you read him, you have so many things acting upon your senses. And that is what is really attractive about the way Jayanta Mahapatra weaves words into images and then images into poems. Yes, if Bidyut sir would like to respond to what Pallavi said, then please go ahead.
No, yeah, it's very. I'm quite happy to hear Rilke, and I love Rilke. Not only his Juno elegies and other poems, but also letters to a young poet, and also letters to a young poet. He wrote those letters to Franz Capus, and who was also a budding poet then. And, Rilke, so many things he talks about in that. I remember these 2 important lines from Letters to a Young Poet, that he says, "For one human being to love another is perhaps the greatest task of all. It is the ultimate test. It is the epitome. Actually, it is the striving for which all other striving is merely preparation." And that. And this tremendous sense of love for the world. I think that is in fact the reason why he could not leave Cuttack, or the way Aga Shahid Ali, went back to Begum Akhtar's ghazals time and again. And I quite resonate with what Pallavi said about reading. That happens to us. I was thinking of, I was reading Nikos Kazantzakis' Zorba the Greek. He had been nominated for Nobel Prize in the same year as Camus. He didn't get it for political reasons. He lost to Camus. I won't say lost to Camus, but Camus by one vote. And Camus went on to say that he was much more deserving than him. When I read life of this character called Zorba the Greek, Zorba is not from India. Why is it that when I read Zorba, I am so connected to Zorba? Okay. And I think some writers do that. I think it was Kafka, who once said that, writing acts as an axe in the frozen sea in you. It completely disturbs you. And it's very much like, as you say, Vipassana meditation. It brings back all those repressed sedimentations. Then, for that kind of a serenity, it needs to first bring all the emotions out. That happens to me actually, and I was quite interested in what Pallavi was speaking actually, and it was quite interesting how she mentioned Rilke, and Rilke was also very close to Tolstoy, certain level. But it's true. It's true that something that captures our attention, be it poetry, be it reading, there is some kind of an, I would say, that is actually called love. When it is not contaminated or tinged with any kind of expectation. Is it possible to really be like that without any expectation and loving somebody or something completely without any prologue or without an epilogue? Okay. And I think it is possible. And that we see in great writers, great poets, and who have nothing but that love for the world. And that is in fact the reason why a writer cannot leave the world, because the poetry is about the world. You cannot go to somewhere else and write poetry. I think Robert Frost writes in his poem Birches that earth is the place for love, and I don't know if it will go get better anywhere else. Okay, so again I go back to Iris Murdoch, who said that good is the reality of which God is the dream. So I think poetry is the example that the thing that we call God is real in the sense of love. I think all of us must have watched that film. Would have got Dead Poets Society, right? So the words do that to us, right? I think most of us are just victims of words. That's why there is a word called lunatic. Luna means moon, tick means struck. So we were maybe like, the word struck that way. And words do that to us. That is what the great Sant Tukaram said, right? Words are all that I have, and words are all that I can offer. What else can I give you? I don't have wealth. I don't have riches. I don't have this and that. But I can make you feel good by telling you something. And is it tangible? Not everything has to be tangible. Not everything has to be palpable. Really. Very much like air that we breathe. We cannot see, but we breathe, right? So love is like that, and that's why all these writers, actually my university also had invited me to talk about Jayanta Mahapatra. I said what to say. I mean, I would have liked to join on my laptop. Otherwise, I would have made you hear the voice of Jayanta Mahapatra. But maybe on the next meeting I'll. But thank you, Pallavi, for that. And you are really, the writers that you are reading, great writers, Rilke and others. I'm rereading now, by the way, Marcus Aurelius after a long time. Yeah.
I feel very happy with the way the session has unfolded. Yes, words do something to us, and words have done something to us today. All our words put together. And if Dr. Anuradha would like to say something, then please go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's the sheer joy of reading something and being able to comprehend it and interpret it. That's what gives us joy. I mean, as writer, it's a different thing to write a poem, see it on manifested on a paper, and whether you publish it or you read it to one person or to yourself, but to being able to read others and know those thoughts and being able to relate to it, that's what gives joy. This session has been very interesting for me, first of all, because being a teacher and sitting somewhere and just hearing to people speaking for 1 hour without speaking anything, when so many thoughts are coming to your mind, I think that's challenging, and it's very refreshing to be able to just to listen. People speaking about so many things. Sir started with hunger. I have this. My first experience with hunger was that I was studying diploma in translation studies in Sambalpur University, and I was given the poem "Hunger" to translate, and it was a very bad translation. My supervisor said, redo it. That was my first encounter with Jayanta Mahapatra. And then I thought, what is this man is writing? Why I can't translate him? Then I went on to read him. I read that poem, his translation, his original, both Odia and English. And I thought that I could never have been able to translate this poem. In this session, there were so many things that came. We talked about why we write poem, how poem comes to us, what is translation, what is lost in translation, what we gain in translation. Jatin Naik, even if we were in Sambalpur University, I had this opportunity to have been taught by Jatin Naik and Himanshu Mahapatra. Once there was a session going on in translation. Someone asked Jayant Naik that what is translation? What is untranslatability? And he said that I start my car from my home and then I go to my university. When I start till I reach when I start from my home, I can never say that I will reach to the university on time and safely. He said that is the process of translation. He has this unique way of talking about all these things. And yes, then we came back to Urdu poetry and Aga Sahid Ali and Tukaram. I think all these poets, everyone who writes poetry, who reads poetry, who appreciate poetry, I think the only thing is that we all are searching something, and at the same time we all are finding that thing in poetry. This search and find, and that thing is going on, it's repeated. You think that you find it, But the next moment you feel that no, I'm still searching for something. I have never reached there. I think that is what poetry is all about. That eternal journey, which is life, questions and answers that never end. And I think poetry, poets, it's a never ending affair. It's never going to end. And if next session we will talk about Jayanta Mahapatra, then we will know more about him. To be very honest, I'm not a very big fan of Jayanta Mahapatra. I love Bibhu Padhi more, and I'm more into his poetry when it comes to Odisha. But then again, Mahapatra's decision to stay here in Odisha and to talk about Odisha, I think it's because of that sheer joy of being attached to something, like you, all of you said, going to the market and waving to someone, knowing that this is my place, belongingness. In A.K. Ramanujan or Aga Sahid Ali, you read, there is this question of belongingness. Even if they are there, they're accepted, but that sense of belongingness is never there. They always, through their poetry, come back. That is what you do not find in Jayant Mahapatra's poetry. He's always at home, and he's giving that home to the other who are reading it. This is how my home is. And then sir bring in Akhya Mahanti, and what I think Jan Mahapatra writes in his poetry in a very crude language. Akhya Mahanti has said that in a very beautiful language in through his music. I think his music is also all about Cuttack and Odisha, more about Cuttack, just like Jan Mahapatra's poetry. So yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I love this session.
In fact, I'm very close to both Bibhu uncle and also Jayanta Mahapatra. And I remember when I sent my books to Bibhu uncle and Jayanta Mahapatra, both of them had called me. Okay, and when Bibhu uncle had called me, now he told me, don't call me sir, call me uncle. So I call him Bibhu uncle, Bibhu Padi, the great poet. And recently TLS published him, Times Literary Supplement also. And Bibhu uncle had put together the names of journals and sent to me. Vidyut, send your poems to this. And he told me something. I said, sir, initially I would call him sir. Sir, my first poetry collection has poems from my BA days. And Bibhu uncle said, Vidyut, usually writers hide their first book. You don't have to write. You have done a good job. and just same thing Jayanta Mahapatra also said. So yes, I mean, these two poets have contributed so much, and from Odisha, both these poets to Indian poetry, Indian English poetry.
Yes.
Actually,
Bibhu Padi is less explored actually.
Less explored, but very
I think
tense poet.
Yes, and he has a different picture of Odisha in his poetry.
Yeah. Different picture of Odisha, and also he has one poem called Friday Lamb Curry or something. There is a poem. If you read that, how he has blended, William Blake's Songs of Innocence, and he brought in there, and beautifully. And good that you reminded me, because a few days ago I had texted him. He was not keeping well, you uncle. So I was thinking of calling him actually. So I'll call him maybe today or something.
Yes, that's what it is, and I am actually more into Hindi and Urdu poetry than into Odia.
Okay.
I mean, I feel at ease in Hindi, more in Hindi than in Odia, but I think that's where this whole concept comes when we talk about why someone whose mother tongue is Odia writes in Hindi or in English. I think we all think in our mother tongue. And then this while we are writing it, that this gets translated. I mean, there is a dialogue going on between both the languages inside the mind. When I was doing my PhD, there was this thing that lyric poetry is subjective and it is not dialogic in nature. But I said that the very dialogue happens inside your mind while you are writing a poetry. It's maybe it's from imagination to language, or from one language to other language, or from a dream or an image to words. The translation is happening nonetheless. The process is there. So there is a dialogue always happening when you are writing poetry, and I think that is that.
Even Joseph Conrad also learned English in his 20s, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it doesn't matter the language that you use. For example, the Navya movement in Kannada literature, like U.R. Anantamurthy, P. Lankesh,
Yes.
and
Yes.
the
Yes.
last luminary of Navya movement was Girish Karnad. All of them are equally capable of writing in English, but they chose to write in Kannada
Yeah.
also. So I think that
Mm-hmm.
is a pure accident with the language that
And
we choose. Yeah.
and all these bilingual poets that we talk about.
Yeah.
You mentioned Arun Kolatkar. When you
Yeah.
mentioned Jayanta Mahapatra's Dholi, I remember Arun Kolatkar's
Yeah.
Sarpasatra.
Yeah, Sapasatra, yeah.
So
And
it is a
also
very,
Yachuri. Sorry, what is that?
yeah,
Jejuri poems.
Jejuri. In Sarpasatra, he is also talking about this, not history, but he is trying to dissect the whole
Yeah.
mythology, the whole concept of good and evil, and just like he talks about history in Dholi. So I think that's and it's very difficult to disconnect poets from poets. Somehow they are all connected in what they are saying. Just like it is said that there is nothing new to say, everything has already been said. If we say that poetry is all about love, then is there something that hasn't yet been talked about love? Love has been the most cliched subject in this world. So what it that makes it new is the way someone looks at it.
I think somebody said, no, the way um, there are many hearts, there are many loves.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, maybe the new way of putting the same thing, we say "I love you" to somebody. And now these
Yes.
days, because of WhatsApp, we randomly send heart emojis to people. Now the question
Everyone.
arises is that
Everyone.
the point is but just imagine the same thing. If I say that, Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose that is newly sprung in June. My love is like a melody that is swiftly played on tune. How beautiful it sounds. Maybe a different way of saying something.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's something beautiful, Anuradha ma'am, what you said, that we can't speak of one poet and just stop there, because if we speak of one poet, definitely other poets would come in, and they enrich each other, and that's the right thing to say. And that's why we cannot just, if we are talking about Jayanta Mahapatra, we cannot just talk about his poems, but we have to talk about other poets as well. And I'm glad in this session we talked about Jayanta Mahapatra, but we also talked about poetry in general, and we talked about so many other poets and how they viewed the world. Because we would just wind up now, unless Nikita wants to say something, because she hasn't said anything. Nikita, would you like to say something?
No, ma'am, I will not. I will not defile this with any words. I will be the silence, the container that wherein holds all the words and worlds, which is silence. So
Anuradha ma'am, that is how we can say love in different languages.
Yes. Yes.
Nikita has summed up that beautifully, because we all have spoken and she is remaining silent.
She is
Yes.
actually
He is
clever,
holding
because
all our love.
yeah, and she is with that inconceivable silence with which we began this session. So thank you, Nikita. And I would like to conclude this session with this line from Jayanta Mahapatra. He says, poetry is voice, vak, and it is the voice which is forged from those elements which constitute the world both within and without. A voice which carries with it its unusual power of survival. So it is about survival. We are all surviving, and whatever it is that we are doing, we are reading, we are thinking, we are loving, and we are contemplating. Whatever it is we are doing it in various ways. And, ways have no end. Ways are endless. And that is why we have literature, as, Pallavi was pointing out. And we began this discussion with the poem Hunger. Vidyut sir talked about hunger, and Anuradha ma'am also talked about her experience of attempting to translate hunger. So I think we should end the session with the reading of the poem Hunger, and then we would leave everything else to silence. Hunger. It was hard to believe the flesh was heavy on my back. The fisherman said, "Will you have her?" carelessly, trailing his nets and his nerves, as though his words sanctified the purpose with which he faced himself. I saw his white bone thrash his eyes. I followed him across the sprawling sands, my mind thumping in the flesh's sling. Hope lay perhaps in burning the house I lived in. Silence gripped my sleeves, his body clawed at the froth his old nets had dragged up from the seas. In the flickering dark, his lean-to opened like a wound. The wind was I, and the days and nights before. Palm fronds scratched my skin. Inside the shack, an oil lamp splayed the hours bunched to those walls. Over and over, the sticky soot crossed the space of my mind. I heard him say, "My daughter, she's just turned 15. Feel her. I'll be back soon. Your bus leaves at 9. The sky fell on me, and a father's exhausted while. Long and lean, her ears were cold as rubber. She opened her wormy legs wide. I felt the hunger there, the other one, the fish slithering, turning inside. So we wind up this session, this first session on Jayanta Mahapatra's poetry with silences, and we would like to be with those silences for a while. Thank you, Dr. Vidyut Bhushan Jaina, Dr. Anuradha Mishra, Pallavi, Nikita, for being here and making this session a very beautiful one. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Shatrughan. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.